A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for this special media briefing on the occasion of the second virtual summit between India and Australia, which has just concluded. To give us a sense of the discussions and also to take up some of your questions, we have the privilege of having with us today Foreign Secretary Sir Shri Harsh Vardhan Shringla. We also have with us Joint Secretary looking after Oceania Division in the Ministry of External Affairs. It's Paramita here. And so, without much ado, may I hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Narendra. Namaskar and good afternoon. As you're aware, Honourable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji and Prime Minister of Australia, Honourable Scott Morrison, held a virtual summit today. In fact, the summit concluded just a short while ago. We saw that the summit was a very fruitful, constructive and warm exchange of views. The virtual summit reflects the close ties that exist between India and Australia, as also the shared vision of both Prime Ministers to advance this bilateral partnership. Both the Prime Minister and Prime Minister Scott Morrison stressed on the high priority they attach to our bilateral relationship and the keen focus to enhance further the comprehensive strategic partnership between our two countries. You recall that the last summit, which was also held virtually between the two leaders, took place in June 2020. The summit today gave an opportunity for the two leaders to review the bilateral relationship in that intervening period to also take stock of the comprehensive strategic partnership framework, regular high-level engagements that have been held between the two countries. The leaders also recalled their previous meetings, including those held on the sidelines of the Quad Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. in September last year, and on the sidelines of COP26 in Glasgow in November last year, where they jointly launched the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, so IRIS, along with UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson. As you would recall, that this was a part of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI, and both Prime Ministers, along with the UK Prime Minister, were the co-chairs of this IRIS initiative that was launched by them together. Today's summit was held over an hour and covered the entire range of bilateral issues that were there before us. The wide-ranging discussions also covered regional and multilateral issues of interest. Prime Minister Modi indicated that as two democracies, India and Australia had similar goals and aspirations. Prime Minister Scott Morrison welcomed India's 2023 G20 presidency and reiterated Australia's commitment to work closely with us on economic issues of global interest and concern. The agenda of the meeting covered the status of various new initiatives and mechanisms agreed under the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The Prime Ministers exchanged views on how COVID-19 had impacted across the globe and our respective responses and cooperation in critical areas such as health, vaccines, cyber, emerging technologies and supply chains. Incidentally, both Prime Ministers also gave a sense of what was done in our own countries. Prime Minister spoke about the fact that 90% of our adult population had been vaccinated. He also spoke about Vaccine Maitri and the vaccines that we had distributed to countries in our region and beyond, and also about the Quad vaccine partnership. This is an important initiative that involves both Australia and India as members of the Quad. The Australian Prime Minister also informed Prime Minister about their own vaccine initiatives and the successes that they've had in dealing with COVID-19. In a reiteration of for commitment to a progressive Indo-Pacific region, both leaders discussed calibrating and cooperating with each other on support to Pacific Island countries for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. and in combating climate change through initiatives like the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. The leaders exchanged perspectives about regional and multilateral matters and global issues of mutual interest, including shared concerns such as terrorism. You will, of course, see the joint statement soon, so some of this information would be contained in the joint statement concluded at the summit. Both leaders referred to their strong bilateral relationship as important not only from a bilateral perspective, but also, as I mentioned, under the Quad format, calling it a factor of stability in the Indo-Pacific. The Australian Prime Minister appreciated the significant presence of a large Indian diaspora in Australia. He stressed on the importance attached by Australia to its relations with India. I think there was a sense that our cooperation had extended to sectors across the board. I think in particular in terms of investments, in terms of critical minerals, in terms of clean energy, in terms of water, agriculture. These were areas that both sides saw as highly potential. And I think there was a call for facilitating migration and mobility for students and professionals between the two countries. There was a sense between both Prime Ministers that two important areas in our partnership related to people-to-people contact, especially the youth, in terms of education and in terms of tourism exchanges between both our countries. Science and technology was an important area of cooperation. The leaders welcomed the extension of the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund. It's an area of collaboration on science, technology, and research, and both Prime Ministers referred to it as a pillar of our collaboration in these areas. The Prime Ministers expressed commitment to build on the success of the 2021 India-Australia Circular Economy Hackathon. As you are aware, the hackathon was held last year, and essentially this involved a discussion of the circular economy, converting waste to wealth, and joint initiatives on new and renewable energy. And this is an area where the two Prime Ministers themselves had not only shown interest but also been involved in the concluding session. And a significant outcome of the virtual summit was a decision to hold annual summits at the level of the heads of government under the comprehensive strategic partnership. I think this is one major outcome. And Australia would be the third country with which India will have an institutionalized annual summit. As part of other outcomes of the virtual summit, both leaders welcomed the signing of the MOU on cooperation in the critical mining sector. This is an MOU between India's Khanij Bidesh India Limited and Australia's Critical Minerals Facilitation Office, and would establish a framework for building partnerships in critical minerals investment. As you can imagine, this is an important area for both our countries, and this agreement would give us the opportunities to both invest in Australia's critical mineral sector and get Australian expertise in this area. There was also a letter of intent signed between India and Australia to work towards concluding a migration and mobility partnership agreement on facilitating migration and mobility between the two countries. I think this is something the two Prime Ministers referred to and said would be an area of great interest, because, as I said again, it involves both education and technology and the involvement of younger people between our two countries. It's an important area. And a signing of an MOU between Prasar Bharati and the Special Broadcasting Service of Australia. It would basically allow for exchange of programs, expertise in this sector, and would facilitate daily slots on television channels in Australia for Doordarshan, India, Doordarshan News, and DD Sahyadri. The two Prime Ministers also agreed that there would be increasing cooperation between India's National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, the NIIF, and Australia's Pension and Sovereign Fund, which is called the Future Fund. This again is important because of our interest in attracting Australian investments in our infrastructure development. India will offer the same tax benefits for Australia's sovereign and pension funds in India as as is given in Australia. In other words, we are willing to match the tax benefits that Australia gives to its sovereign and pension funds. Once they invest in India, they will get similar benefits. Prime Minister also proposed the early integration of digital payments platforms of both countries, and we have the UPI in India, and Australia has a new payment platform. This, as the Prime Minister mentioned, would greatly help the 7 lakh Indian community members in Australia. It would also promote, enable the emergence of India as a popular education and tourism destination for Australia. For Pacific Island countries under the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, which I said was a part of the CDRI, both India and Australia will be providing funds. Australia had committed earlier 10 million Australian dollars, and India will match those funds for IRIS. Similarly, India will also match Australia's funding for Pacific Island states under the International Solar Alliance. Australia is investing 10 million Australian dollars, which is we will invest an equal amount of 50 crore rupees in this particular initiative. As you're aware, Australia has returned 29 artifacts, cultural artifacts to India. These are centuries old artifacts, very valuable artifacts, and Prime Minister welcomed the return and acknowledged this gesture of goodwill and friendship on the part of Australia. One important area of discussion and cooperation was defense and security, and both sides announced the setting up of the General Bipin Rawat Young Defense Officers Exchange Program. This will enable younger officers from both sides to familiarize themselves in each other's countries, and will greatly increase the service-to-service contacts between our countries. There are a number of sectors covered in agreements, and essentially this speaks of our wide-ranging nature of our bilateral cooperation with Australia in these sectors. There were several initiatives, other initiatives with Australia in the sectors of space, science and technology, critical minerals, energy, etc. You will see the details in the joint statement that you would have with you. The summit, to conclude, the summit re-established our shared belief with Australia in democracy and the values attached to the rule of law. The depth of discussions held today indicates the high importance India and Australia attach to the bilateral relationship. So I'll stop here, Aruna.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. I'll open the floor for questions, as I can see as always. Okay, this time, Sridhar, let's start.
Sir, Sridhar from the Asian Media. Can you tell us something about the discussions between the two leaders on Ukraine? And also, was China discussed as it was during the Japan summit? And
I think we'll one question at a time. Okay, Siddhant.
Critical minerals has been the focus of this summit. How does it help both the countries, and what are the details in terms of their plans of sourcing minerals from Australia? I mean, if you can give us little details.
Okay. Microphone.
This is Yeshi Seri from the New Indian Express. I'd like to know whether any progress was made on the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, because the interim has already been talked about.
One there.
Hi, this is Nirmala. I write for the Straits Times. I just wanted to know about the discussions on Myanmar.
Okay, I'll take the last question here before I come to you. Yeah, Akhilesh.
Sir, Akhilesh Sohan from Sansad TV. Has there been any talk with the Australian counterpart about making any joint, effort to stop the war that is going on between Russia and Ukraine? To make a quad stand on this issue.
Joint or quad?
Joint quad stand. Yeah.
Well, let me begin by saying that the two leaders exchanged views on important topical areas relating to our region and beyond. Obviously, the Ukraine issue was discussed, as was the issue of China. On Ukraine, I think it was clear that the two sides had referred to the Quad summit, in which the leaders had a fairly clear perspective that the situation in Ukraine should not impact on the Indo-Pacific, and that the focus and priority of the Indo-Pacific for the Quad and for our countries should continue to remain as they were. Prime Minister, I think Morrison was quite clear that as far as he was concerned, the Quad's focus was on the Indo-Pacific, and that he had made that clear at the Quad, and he has continued to emphasize that aspect in our discussions with us. He also, I think, expressed understanding for India's position on the issue of Ukraine, which he felt was definitely reflected our own situation, our own sort of considerations as far as the overall aspects of the discussion on Ukraine were concerned. I think there was a sense that there was concern, serious concern, you can say, about the ongoing conflict and the humanitarian situation in the Ukraine. This is something that both leaders clearly spoke about, and I think also the need for a cessation of hostilities and violence in that regard. I think there was equal emphasis on the fact that the international order stands on the UN Charter on the rule of law and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. That aspect was also an area that both leaders very clearly emphasized. And of course, the humanitarian aspects of the situation, both in terms of allowing consideration for civilians, especially women and children, and also humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, was something that was clearly spoken about, and you will find that these are areas that are clearly there. But what I'm saying is that there was a clear sense of both sides understood where they came from, and I think there was a great deal of comfort in the fact that both of us saw the fact that the conflict in Europe should not be a reason for us to divert our attention from the Indo-Pacific region, and that our position as far as the Quad is concerned also was on similar lines. The other issue, I think, Siddhant, you had asked about critical minerals.
China.
Yeah, well, on China, of course, I think both leaders exchanged their perspectives. Prime Minister did refer to the line of actual control in Ladakh, the incidents of the previous year, and he emphasized that peace and tranquility in the border areas was an essential prerequisite for normalization of relations with China. Prime Minister Morrison also gave a fairly detailed perspective of how he saw China and its actions in the region, and he spoke in particular about the South China Sea. Coming to critical minerals, I think there was a sense that there could be joint investments in Australian projects. We have a shared interest in having collaborations in critical minerals. India, as a manufacturing hub, requires access to critical minerals, and Australia is a repository of a lot of the critical minerals in the world, and that our investments together in this area would strengthen the resilience of supply chains when it comes to critical minerals. As you know, India, Japan, Australia also have a working group at the ministerial level on on critical and on resilient supply chains, and critical minerals is an important part of that initiative. On Myanmar, I think both sides, of course, were concerned about the situation. I think the sense of a cessation of violence, a sense of the fact that the civilian population in particular should be protected. There should be a release of those who are arbitrarily detained, and that there should be humanitarian access to Myanmar was emphasized. From our side, of course, we did stress that we have a long border with Myanmar, that our relationship was both historical and based on people-to-people ties, and that we believe that both engagement and humanitarian aspect of our relationship with Myanmar has to be kept in mind. Both our sides spoke about supporting the ASEAN 5-point consensus on Myanmar, the ASEAN's initiatives in Myanmar, and I think agreed that we would look at that effort as an important way of trying to find a solution on the issue as we have it. And of course, that the international community must also come together for humanitarian assistance to Myanmar, and that the people of Myanmar should not be, let's say, have to suffer the consequences of the situation. I think that more or less answers various questions, including the Quad. With regard to SECA, in a certain sense, we have had fairly extensive talks on the issue of the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. We launched negotiations, following the 17th Joint Ministerial Commission in September 2021 in Delhi. So it's not been a long time that we have been discussing this issue, but we've had fairly, I think, intense discussions and negotiations. I think both our sides believe that there should be a balanced trade agreement for expanded trade and investment flows for the benefit of both our economies. We have made substantial progress in these negotiations. Our respective ministers have been in regular touch to monitor progress on the negotiations. Both sides are keen to finalize this agreement in view of the benefits that we stand to gain from in furthering trade and investment. The Prime Ministers, I think, reviewed the situation, and it was agreed that we would try and finalize this agreement at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you, sir. We have a time constraint, so I'll just have last couple of questions. Yeah, please. I think we'll not be able to accommodate all, but anyway.
Sir, Meghna from DD News. Sir, what have been the talks on the education sector, especially in terms of scholarship programs? Also wanted to ask if you can give us some details about the cooperation in the space sector.
Space. 1 second, sorry. Yeah, Shinja, please.
So, over here. So Australia was once part of Malabar, then for a long time they were not part of Malabar. Now they are again part of Malabar. Is there a commitment that they will continue to be in Malabar?
Nanima?
Sir, Nanima from ThePrint wanted to understand again on CECA. Yesterday, the Australian High Commissioner said that there will be an early harvest agreement that will be signed by the end of this month. Is India also stating the same thing? Thank you so much. And also, sir, on the procurement of lithium, if you can shed some light.
Anyway, sorry, Sudhi? I'll come to you.
So, Shri Rajan from Bloomberg, sir, is there an figure or an understanding you could get on the investments that have been talked about? What figure, is there anything of that sort?
And final question here.
So, this is Arun from the New Indian. Can we expect a further talk on RCP? This is my first question. And secondly, what are the initiatives? RCP, yeah, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Yeah, and what are the initiatives we may take under this CSP, this Comprehensive Strategic Partnership?
So I think as far as education is concerned, and this is something that Meghna had asked, what are the developments in that front? We have a task force between our two countries, and this task force has agreed to work towards a mutual recognition of educational qualifications. This, as you can imagine, is very important for us because of the number of students, Indian students who are in Australia. I think mutual recognition of degrees means that you can do a degree in Australia and that is recognized back in India as well. So it's an important step forward that we are looking at this. Australia has also announced a Maitri scholarship scheme, scholarship and fellowship scheme that will be, I think, helpful. In particular, the Australian Prime Minister mentioned about STEM students from India, and this is an important area. From our point of view, there is active collaboration in the space sector, between India and Australia. This, as you know, that ISRO is working with the Australian Space Agency, and I think this relates to certain technologies that both sides need, and it's again an emerging area of our cooperation. We are looking at new areas in the fields of science and technology, research, etc. And this, I think, is an important aspect of that regard. Now, there was also I think Sirinjoy had the question on Malabar. As you know, Australia has been inducted into the Malabar framework. They have participated in Malabar exercises in 2020 and 2021. And they will continue to be part of the Malabar, let's say, group of countries that participate in these exercises. And I think we will certainly look forward to continued participation of all concerned. As far as investments are concerned, I think Nainima's question was on investments. It's around $15 billion is the quantum of investments between, we're talking about US dollars between Australia, of Australian investments in India, and Indian investments in Australia are about $12 billion. And both investments are growing steadily. Both countries are providing, trying to facilitate these investments. The Australians have announced a certain scheme by which they will encourage their technology companies to come and invest in India, come and implant themselves in India. And I think these are all this all augurs well for the future of a knowledge partnership between our two countries. And across sectors, you can look at, the financial area, real estate. These are areas where we're looking at investments. But I did mention specifically Australian investments in our National Investment Infrastructure Fund. In other words, Infrastructure Investment Fund, the NIIF, which is an area where we hope to draw both pension and sovereign funds, mutual funds, and this is an area where I think there's potential for significant investments in our infrastructure development. And this is again an announcement of the summit. So this is a deliverable from the summit. Lithium, as I told you, I think Australia is one of the largest producers of critical minerals, including lithium. The MOU that facilitates co-investments in the critical mineral sector would greatly, I think, benefit access to these critical minerals, and it is part of our supply chain initiatives also. As far as RCEP is concerned, let me say that this discussion, this was not a part of the discussion. We have clearly said that we are unable to, be a part of RCEP for reasons that have been clearly outlined, and I think this was no longer on the agenda. The Sika.
Yeah, so Sika,
Yeah.
early harvest.
Yeah, that is what I meant. That on the early harvest aspect of Sika, we agreed that both sides would try and work to conclude this at the earliest possible. I think this is something that we hope to, sort out the remaining issues and come up with something that would be seen as an outcome on this area. Space, just to conclude what we're saying about space, tracking and telemetry command center in the Cocos Island is an important aspect of our space cooperation because it helps the Gaganyaan mission. As you know, this is a very important mission in our space area, and this is an area that we're working on. And as I said, ISRO and the Australian Space Agency are cooperating closely on a number of issues.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the comprehensive perspective. Sorry, and I don't think we have time for any more questions.
Just a clarification.
Microphone.
So, in the wake of this summit between Australia and India, there has been one person who has actually praised India for going out, and that is Imran. Would you like to speak?
I will tackle that in our weekly, sir. So I think that's not for today evening. I had offered you that time, I'm afraid. I had, you were talking to somebody else. Okay. Huh? You had a query? What is something different? Same question?
I mean, to say that one person would be wrong, I think we have received praise across the board for many of our foreign policy initiatives at the level of the Prime Minister. And I think, our record speaks for itself.